So I think as foster and adoptive parents, we might have trouble, maybe we're being too lenient. Maybe we're saying, here's your 25th chance, but I swear this is the last one. I know this was hard for you. Let's try again. Yeah. And we find ourselves maybe just not setting a healthy boundary. Or maybe we are so hypervigilant that we're setting some unrealistic boundaries.
Welcome to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, a show about adoption, foster care, advocacy, and becoming the best caregiver possible. Pull up a chair. We're glad you've joined us. Here are your hosts, Mike and Kristen Berry.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people all over the world, welcome to the Honestly Adoption Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. We are glad you've joined us for season 29, episode 273. Wow, I almost got that wrong. We are diving into a big topic today, talking about boundaries with our children. That's a tricky topic. Kristen and I have a open discussion about how to set boundaries with your children, how to avoid being taken advantage of, and how to navigate all the spaces in between that. You're going to love this discussion. If you have been struggling with boundaries with your children, then this is the episode for you. I can promise you that. If you are brand new, we are so glad you're here. Make sure you check out our podcast page at honestlyadoption.com/podcast and leave us a review. Jump over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, anywhere podcasts are found, and let us know what you think. Guys, listen, this show, we are excited to say, has reached around the world several times over. We are now in 70 different countries. We average around 30,000 to 40,000 downloads a month, and it just keeps growing. And it's so exciting that caregivers just like yourselves are being reached with messages of hope and encouragement and inspiration. It's all part of this show. We are glad you're here. And listen, if you want to learn more about what we do at Honestly Adoption, make sure you visit honestlyadoption.com and check out all of our free resources. We have several free resources. In fact, when you visit that page, you can actually get free parenting lessons from the two of us, as well as a bunch of other freebies. And you can also check out some of our in-depth resources, our courses, our coaching, all that good stuff. We're glad you're here. Listen, what we always want you to know as a caregiver is that you are loved, you are good, and your story isn't over. And that is what we want you to know through this show. And as we jump into this topic on boundaries, we want you to know you're not alone. So if you've struggled with this, you're in the right place. We are glad you're here. And now let's get on with the show. And the topic that we're going to cover today that I'm going to just ask Kristen questions about centers around healthy boundaries. One of the things that we struggle with as caregivers, you guys struggle with this, with children who have a trauma history, is knowing when to set boundaries and also knowing the difference between a boundary and a healthy boundary. There is a difference. So I want to just talk about that and pick your brain on that. So pretend I'm Nicole and we're having a discussion. So let's talk about that. Where do we begin with? I guess the place to start is what do boundaries look like in parenting in general, but then we'll transition from there to healthy boundaries, if that makes sense.
Well, I think in order to understand boundaries, you need to always kind of take yourself out of it and think about something else. What are some boundaries? I have a fence around my yard so that my dogs don't run into traffic. A boundary. When you put a baby in a crib, there's walls around that so they don't fall out. That's a boundary. Yeah. So when you think about boundaries, you take that out of relationships and you put it into something else. It's a little bit easier to then pull it back into relationships and say, a boundary for myself is something that's healthy, that keeps me safe, that keeps others safe. So when you're talking about boundaries in relationships, I just sometimes think you need to pull in that same concept and narrow it down to that more basic idea. A boundary is something that keeps my heart safe. A boundary is something that keeps my mind safe. A boundary is something that keeps my body safe. You mentioned something I thought this was interesting because we didn't really talk about this before we sat down. We just said, oh, let's talk about boundaries.
Fire away, man.
But you said this is complicated for foster and adoptive families. What do you think that makes it different for a foster and adoptive family than biological parenting?
Family. Well, I think the what makes it different or more complicated is that you're dealing with a trauma history. So a neurotypical child, a child that's developing for the most part typical, may have an understanding of, you know, boundaries, or may be able to formulate social cues. But I think that trauma histories often, not all the time, often kind of add an extra layer there that we have to work through. That's why I think there's a little bit of a difference. But I also, you know, the question that comes to mind is because I think a lot of you that are watching this right now are wondering, okay, I have a child who manipulates. I have a child who, you know, tells lies. I have a child who will look at me and understand the boundary that I'm setting, and then 5 minutes later crosses the boundary. What do I do there? You know, so does that make sense like that? I think that's the difference right there.
I think that that's the difference for maybe how our children perceive boundaries. Yeah. And then I would add to that sometimes as foster and adoptive parents, we may have some trouble within that context of setting a boundary because we're learning that our children have dealt with trauma. Yep. We're learning that, really trauma. Our children who are in the foster care system, who have experienced the foster care system, have experienced adoption, have experienced trauma, period. So if we know that that's the baseline, being separated from your parents is a trauma, end of story, that's where we're starting. Mm-hmm. If we begin to know and understand that, we may have some difficulty setting boundaries because we're thinking we need to do more. We need to give in to more. In that, empathy and understanding also would be this kind of free-for-all, maybe. Yeah. I know for myself, it's something that, you know, maybe my child wants something, wants a third chance or a fifth chance or a 10th chance, and there's just one more chance. And I have in the back of my mind, man, this child experienced so many things. Right. Maybe they didn't mean to get in trouble at school. Maybe I shouldn't give this boundary. Maybe I shouldn't follow through with the consequence. Or maybe I shouldn't make them wait for, you know, I don't know, TV time or something. Yeah. Because I think in our families, we're trying to pull in a lot of different dynamics, parenting in general. And then we add another layer on top of that. What if when my child says, but I'm hungry, I want a snack, what if they're really reliving their childhood trauma? Yeah. So as foster and adoptive parents, I think then we have this extra layer, this extra place where we need to always be managing. How can I be a good parent? Yeah. How can I set a good and healthy boundary? Mm-hmm. And also, is there something that I'm missing that's happening here? So I think as foster and adoptive parents, we might have trouble, you know, maybe we're being too lenient. Maybe we're saying, okay, here's your 25th chance, but I swear this is the last one. You know, I know this was hard for you. Let's try again. Yeah. And we find ourselves maybe just not setting a healthy boundary. Or maybe we are so hypervigilant that we're setting some unrealistic boundaries. Maybe we've got a teenager and we never let them go out of our sight. Never for 1 minute. Right. And when we step back outside of that and we begin to ask ourselves, what is it that's causing me to create these really strict boundaries? Yeah. Maybe it is a perception that's come in, you know, to that parenting. So, you know, understanding then, why am I struggling? Why am I setting boundaries that are too strict? Or why am I setting boundaries that are too lenient? Right. Yeah. Then we can start to piece those things apart and ask ourselves some different questions about setting boundaries. Yeah, and there's another aspect of this. You alluded to this here a few minutes ago. You know, one thing that we need to keep in mind as caregivers is that
because of trauma's impact on the brain, primarily the impact on the prefrontal cortex where executive functioning skills exist, impulse control, self-control. The fact is, sometimes what we perceive to be as a crossed boundary, the child has no clue.
Sure.
We have communicated the boundary, but we have done everything to walk the child through,
right.
even reminding them, and they still cross it. And we're thinking, oh my gosh, this is just a defiant child. There's a really fine line between defiance and a lack of executive functioning skills that play into this. So, quick story, many, many years ago, we were fostering a child who continually just touched other people's things, right? You would say, that's not yours. And next thing you know, the child is walking through the house wearing it, right?
And you're like, is that yours?
And they look at you and you're thinking, oh my gosh, you're just being defiant. You're just stealing. But then the deeper we looked into executive functioning, there were a few things that we picked up on that. A big characteristic is lack of impulse control, lack of self-control. There's another aspect within executive functioning, within that self-control area of executive functioning that's referred to as inhibitory control. So the ability to stop yourself, right? The inhibitions,
right.
to say, okay, I shouldn't do this, right? Well, when that is dormant because of trauma, there is a lack of inhibitory control, which means that there are no inhibitions, right? So your child who is doing these things in public and you're like, oh my gosh,
sure,
that's a lack of inhibitory control, which also can directly point to that child that just picks something up. They're wearing it, they're wearing the bracelet, and you're thinking, if I don't say anything, this child's just going to walk off with this bracelet.
Right. So then if you have that understanding, you begin to know what's causing that behavior. How do you set boundaries around that?
Yeah.
And I think that can be for anybody who is a special needs parent, for anybody who is a parent of a child who's experienced trauma. We're taking in those extra layers, and then we're saying within this context, how can I set an appropriate boundary? Because we can also, I guess, a good way to gauge if a new boundary needs to go in is, what's my frustration level with this? How are other people reacting to this? Is this child now in the principal's office for stealing?
Right.
Is this child, am I starting to feel mad because stuff is all gone from my room? Am I looking for items and now they've disappeared? All right, so I'm kind of gauging, is this behavior something that is acceptable? Yeah. Is this behavior something that needs a more solid boundary? And how can I create a boundary then that is attainable, that the child can live within? Because sometimes we can create a boundary that our child can't process. Maybe we've given that, 25 paragraphs in a 15-minute conversation, and the child's like, look, I literally have no idea what you just got mad at me. I don't know. Yeah. You're just always mad at me. So now we can bring those boundaries in and really, really simplify them. That's something that we've talked about with safety plans, for instance. Why are safety plans like one thing, one sentence, 3 sentences? It's because we need to bring that in, to narrow that down and to create simplicity with that. So then what's a boundary around taking other people's things? Yeah. Suddenly we can simplify that in a way, and we can then create a strategy that helps the child to learn to live within that boundary. So now we know my child can't really process all of this, so what can I do instead? Or every time I get mad and shout at my child, they shut down and they're still holding the item that I asked them not to hold. Okay, so what can I do instead? I can say, oh, hey, honey, is that pencil yours? No? Yeah. Okay, can you just put that on the table? Now we've created a boundary. There was no shame in that. There was no stomping our feet and saying, you just steal everything. Now, that's not helping to create a healthy boundary. outside of that, then we might say, hey, notice that you had my pencil earlier. I was a little frustrated. I was using that pencil. I'm sure you could tell I was feeling a little frustrated. Let's talk a little bit about touching other people's things.
Yeah.
But we're doing that outside of that. Now we're creating this boundary. I want to let you know that starting today, we're just not going to touch other people's things.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to touch other people's things. You're not going to touch other people's things. In fact, I was wondering, is there anything of yours that's really, really special and it bothers you when people touch it? The child might say, yeah, I have my favorite blanket and it's mine and I like it to be where I like it to be. And then we can say, you know what? I'm glad we're talking about this. So we are all going to respect the boundary around your favorite blanket. It's going to be where you put it at all times. That's your special thing.
Yeah.
And I also want to let you know that we're going to expect everyone to respect our boundaries as well. So we can start to bring those broader concepts that start to make us feel frustrated as caregivers, frustrated as, teachers, and begin to kind of narrow it down, zero in. Because often we're finding ourselves maybe trying to manage all the things that are happening in our home or with our child, and we've kind of lost track of the boundaries. Maybe we find ourselves saying, here's your second chance, only it's the 25th time we've given the second chance. Yeah. And we need to narrow it back in. Hey, you know what? I understand that you want another chance, but also remember when I said there's going to be no screaming at the dinner table? Remember when I said we're not calling each other names anymore?
Right.
That's not something we do as a family.
Yeah.
And here's what we need to do next. And restoration is a conversation for another day. But how can we set boundaries? One of the biggest things that we can do is to simplify what that boundary is. So what is the behavior? What is the action? And then what boundary do we need to set around that? That's going to go into place with older children. Maybe we haven't realized yet what the boundary might need to be. We're about to hand a 16-year-old keys to the car. If we hand them keys to the car and just say, have fun, they're going to go do whatever they want.
Right.
So as we're moving toward those next steps, ideally as parents, we're setting simple boundaries around those. So, hey, I'm so excited that you got your driver's license. Here are the boundaries. And we may need to print those out, put them in the car. Step 1, step 2, step 3. You may not drive with anyone else. It's written right here. No one else is allowed in the car. You may not go outside of our town. 3, I don't know, no texting and driving. No using your phone and driving. Whatever the case may be. Maybe your boundary comes with accountability. You put a camera in the car. You say, that's okay. I've given you these simple boundaries. Here's what you're allowed to do with this car, and that's it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to put a camera in the car. I just want to be able to see at all times that your eyeballs are looking at the road or whatever. So, as our kids grow, there are going to be some boundaries we have to put in place after the fact. But there are going to be a lot of boundaries that we can think of ahead of time. What feels good and safe?
Yeah.
What will keep my child safe? What will keep people safe around my child? And we can begin to put those simple boundaries in place. And as our children then, they do drive the car within town. They do follow the 3 simple rules. And a little bit at a time we say, wow, I really noticed that for 6 months, every time I checked in, every time we had some kind of accountability, you had followed the 3 rules. I want to let you know we're actually changing this boundary. We're widening it a little, and we're trusting that you'll just put one person in the car.
Yeah.
We're trusting that, you can go outside of our town now, but we're trusting that you'll always ask first. So we're shifting, we're widening that boundary.
Yeah.
All of us live within boundaries. But those become wider as we begin to be trustworthy, as we begin to be able to make wise decisions.
Right.
My parents aren't watching how I drive the car anymore.
Yeah.
They're just not. But when I get in the car, I have learned as those boundaries have grown and I've become my own person and I purchased my own car and car insurance, those boundaries have grown. I can choose what to do in the car, but I now choose to respect the boundaries that the state has put in place or that my town has. I drive the speed limit. I don't use my phone in the car. So I am now creating boundaries for myself. And as we see our children grow, we can begin to say, I saw that you put a healthy boundary around yourself, and I really respect that.
Yeah.
There's more we could talk about, but
yeah, there's a lot of other things. And the one thing I will say, in terms of, specifically for those of us that are parenting children who have a trauma history and have trouble remembering. So you set the boundary, you explain the boundary, and then they may not have meant to, pick up the pencil and take it. You're going to find yourself, as our good friend Dr. Ira Chasnoff says, repeating and repeating and repeating and repeating, So it gets frustrating. We know that. We're right there with you. But you may have to say 400 times, hey, remember, that pencil's not yours. I'm going to need you to put it back. And that's okay, because you are helping the child move back into their prefrontal cortex. And you have to step in and be an external brain for your child in a lot of ways. So Don't forget that. Remember that. It's going to help you reduce frustration if you can remember that. And you guys are probably seeing our children walking back behind us in our frame.
I still see you, dude.
Because we're still at home. We film. This is actually in our kitchen right now. We're not on like some set somewhere. This is our real kitchen.
Nobody thinks this is a set.
I don't think anybody does. But if
these
you thought it was,
cabinets are falling off the walls.
They really are. So, but anyways, we hope you guys have gotten a lot out of this.
Thank you for listening to the Honestly Adoption Podcast, a resource courtesy of the Honestly Adoption Company. To learn more about us, visit www.honestlyadoption.com.